I'm John Manzella, and this is the Manzella Report. International trade has lifted millions of people out of poverty, boosted standards of living, and benefited the U.S. more than most countries. Why? The American economic engine thrives on economies of scale, which is designed to produce solutions for the world's 8 billion consumers, not just America's 340 million. But the U.S. is moving down a protectionist path that will weaken our economic growth and competitiveness while hurting consumers and businesses. Now, today, trade supports 41 million American jobs, or about 1 in 4. And those in export-intensive industries earn approximately 18% more than the average wage. Markets outside the U.S. represent 80% of the world's purchasing power and 95% of consumers. But by 2030, the number of global middle-class consumers will rise from 3.5 billion to nearly 5 billion, and virtually all of them will live outside the U.S. Reaching these fast-growing foreign markets is critical, but unfortunately, the winds are against us. Now, I'm going to talk a minute about why trade agreements are so important. We currently only have 14 free trade agreements with 20 countries. Remarkably, these partners account for nearly half of all U.S. exports, despite representing just 6% of the world's consumers. This demonstrates that when trade barriers are reduced, American companies and workers can compete anywhere with great success. However, the U.S. is falling way behind. Today, there are 359 regional trade agreements without U.S. participation, and a flurry of new ones are being negotiated that give foreign countries preferential treatment. This puts U.S. firms in an increasingly less competitive position. And this also will lead to market share losses by American companies abroad. Now, it's important to understand that imports don't weaken the economy. This is a common misperception that has led to policies that attempt to restrict imports. In reality, imports offer a greater selection of consumer and industrial products, a wider range of quality, and access to lower-cost goods and services that effectively subsidize the quality of life for lower and middle-income American consumers. Imports also help keep inflation down and, by the way, create millions of American jobs in marketing, sales, retail, wholesale, and transportation. And since more than half of all U.S. imports are intermediate inputs used in the final production of U.S. goods, they also help keep American manufacturing globally competitive. When considering reducing imports in hopes of stimulating what some speculate is a hollowed-out manufacturing sector, consider this. U.S. manufacturing output today is at a near or all-time high. It's also important to understand that due to demographic trends, our labor shortage is projected to worsen. Why is this important? Currently, there are approximately 8 million American jobs that are not filled. Reducing imports or backshoring low-technology, low-value goods where the manufacturing process cannot be automated makes little sense. Finding American workers to make goods that were previously imported is extremely difficult, and pulling them from other sectors will only drive up prices, resulting in less output and less economic growth. Also misguided is the blaming of imports as a primary cause for declining jobs in the manufacturing sector. As productivity rises due to the introduction of new technologies and automation, the same output simply requires fewer workers. For an example, just look at American agriculture. In 1940, there were 9.4 million farm jobs. Today, there are approximately 2.3 million, yet U.S. agricultural output has skyrocketed. Declining jobs in the manufacturing sector is not new. American manufacturing jobs as a percent of total U.S. employment has been declining since 1944, and almost the entire decline was not caused by imports, but by higher productivity. Now, I want to touch on trade deficits for a moment, because there's a popular assumption that by implementing tariffs, a country will eliminate its trade deficit. This is not true. Trade deficits are not simply a function of exports and imports, but reflect a combination of factors, including savings rates and investment flows. And surprising to many, Germany, Switzerland, and Singapore consistently run trade surpluses, yet they maintain low tariff levels. And India, which is highly protectionist, consistently runs trade deficits, according to data from the World Bank and United Nations. And based on a study of 183 countries, those with higher tariffs typically have larger deficits. Overall, tariffs typically don't work and often backfire. Nevertheless, for decades, U.S. policymakers have turned to tariffs as a tool to protect industries and workers from foreign competition and to increase domestic production. Now, imports, which are paid by the importer and typically passed on to the buyers, do not achieve these goals, causing prices to increase and inflation to rise. And this is a consideration that may keep the Federal Reserve from lowering interest rates and even raising them in the future. Once implemented, tariffs typically create more losses than gains in terms of production levels, economic growth, and jobs. Now, during his first term in March 2018, President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. How did that go? Downstream U.S. industries that use steel and aluminum experienced an annual production loss of $3.4 billion from 2018 to 2021. And for every job gained in the production of steel and aluminum, 16 jobs were lost in steel-using industries. Now, I want to talk a few minutes about how tariffs on Canada and Mexico will hurt North America. On February 1st, 2025, President Trump threatened to impose 25% tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada. He justified this by criticizing their efforts to control illegal drug trafficking and immigration into the U.S. And more recently, on February 10th, President Trump announced he would impose 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from all countries effective in early March. Now, it's important to point out that Canada and Mexico are two of our biggest suppliers of steel and aluminum. Now, Trump's long-standing concern about trade deficits may actually be the key motivating factor here. In this case, consider this important point. On average, 40% of Mexican exports to the U.S. are components and parts that were originally exported from the U.S. to Mexico and incorporated in the Mexican production process. For Canada, 25%. My point is that trade deficits don't always reflect what's happening on the ground and may be a poor data metric to base policy decisions on. Now, to understand the depth of the U.S.-Mexican relationship, perhaps most telling is this. The U.S. exports more to Canada and Mexico than we do to our next 9 largest country destinations combined. If implemented, these tariffs will hurt North America by pushing prices and inflation up and economic growth down. With this in mind, I'd like to just touch on the North American auto industry for a moment, because this industry is so deeply integrated, new tariffs will make it less competitive worldwide, hurting American, Canadian, and Mexican consumers, workers, and companies. And also consider this. Auto components and parts that are made on the continent cross the border several times during the manufacturing process. For example, it's not uncommon for auto parts to begin their manufacturing process in the U.S. and Mexico, be shipped to a plant in Canada, where valuable components are added and tested, be trucked back to a U.S. facility for completion, then exported to an Asian buyer. The result, tariffs would not be applied once, but multiple times, and that will certainly hurt. Now, with all of this in mind, our trade partners may look for better partners. Noted earlier, there are nearly 360 regional trade agreements around the world without U.S. participation, and many more are currently being negotiated. As our trade partners become disillusioned and uncertain of their future trading relationship with the U.S., they will be much more incentivized to forge ahead with new trade agreements without U.S. participation. And consider the fact that there are more than 150 developing countries that represent 6.9 billion people, or approximately 86% of the world's population. Currently, China is the world's largest exporter and biggest trade partner with many of these countries. With both the U.S. and China competing for their hearts, minds, and markets, the U.S. may be perceived as a less trustworthy partner due to its growing tensions with long-standing allies. What's a smarter approach? Well, let me give you a little history. The most severe example is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, implemented on June 17, 1930 by President Hoover. Now, it raised U.S. tariffs by nearly 60%. In anticipation of the act's passage, many of our largest trade partners raised their tariffs against U.S. exports. The result? Export markets dried up, domestic industry slowed, and the U.S. unemployment rate rose to 25% in 1933. Protectionism may have put the great in the Great Depression. While some protectionist measures can be useful when narrowly applied, long-term prosperity depends on expanding trade opportunities, ensuring competitive industries, and balancing economic security with economic growth. The best way to support American workers and businesses is not through trade wars, but through smart, forward-thinking trade policy that enhances U.S. competitiveness in a rapidly changing world. For more details on this topic, read my article in Fair Observer magazine or visit the Manzella report. Thank you.